80/20 says that 1% of what you do produces 50% of what you get. Okay, so it's perfectly okay to have space to think about problems and think about how, well, I'm supposed to look busy. Well, yeah, if it's 1863 and you're laying railroad track with a shovel and a sledgehammer and spikes, then yeah, get busy. Look busy. In that world, if you look busy, you are busy. If you look like you're building a train track, you are building a train track. But you know what? You can almost never tell who's productive by what you see them doing.
Win all in, play my cards right. Up the ante, one blackjack all night. Roll the dice, let it ride. Water the odds, I got snake.
In case you haven't noticed, we love podcasts. In fact, we love building podcasts, everything from development to production. Because of all that, we're building a one-of-a-kind podcast network. If you have a podcast or looking to launch a new podcast, then we should talk. You can message me on Twitter at Eric_Kaz or hit us up any way that works for you. Let's talk about your podcast joining this one-of-a-kind podcast network. I looked back and I was like, all right, I got this email, you reached out, your team had reached out, and your name shows up. I'm like, I know that name, Perry Marshall. Why do I know the name? Well, he wrote this book and this is one of my favorite books. And so I was like, well, I just had to double check because then I saw the name of it and sure enough, sitting right behind you, 80/20 Sales and Marketing. And I had to go to my Kindle library. I was like, I just had to verify it. And I was like, wait, is this really the guy reaching out to us to say, let's talk, let's be on the podcast? And sure enough, I knew it was the answer, but I said to go see it for myself. Well, as I'm thinking through things, I looked back and I went back to my Amazon purchases. It was August 2015. And I had purchased your book. And obviously, here I'm talking about it. I was on this path and this had started before because I had started this business in early 2013. And before that, I really started taking reading seriously. I started thinking more. I started thinking about content and what it all meant. What did I want? I was in the insurance business, life insurance brokerage, going to wealth advisors, and we were doing third-party distributions, point of sale distribution. And I realized that the storytelling, the messaging, just everything in that business was just not what I wanted it to be. I thought there was a unique way to create stories to get in front of people. And your book comes out and I'm going back and looking at it. And I just came to realize this morning that I believe you're one of the reasons I have this podcast today.
Woo!
And I think there's a lot of reasons for it, right? There's a lot of dynamics at play. But I think that I was thinking about content at that time. And maybe perhaps there was some pushes, there's some ideas, there's some thinking that I got to do because of this book, 80/20. And that is exciting for me to have this conversation. And you pointed out something in it, and we'll move on from here too. There's an 80/20 inside of everything. And I'm fascinated by that because we've all probably heard of the 80/20 principle and you talk about in your book, but it's taking it to these next levels, maybe becoming an expert, but thinking through, trying to advance it. And I'm talking too much already, but I'm just excited to chat with you. There's an 80/20 inside of everything. You can take it any direction you want. I do have a question for you that I want you to get to in all this talking. Off the top of your head, like what's the craziest 80/20 that you've analyzed yourself? Because I think about it like, we could watch a basketball game and we can find the 80/20 with the 10 players on the court, right? But you've analyzed it from all different perspectives. What's the craziest 80/20 that you've come across?
Well, just top of the stack is I did a seminar for Entrepreneur Media Conference, the Entrepreneur magazine and the book publishing company. Barbara McCorcoran's there and stuff. And I was doing this breakout session. And I probably had 250 or 300 people in the room. And I go, so everybody who has shoes, stand up. And then I start going, so if you got less than 5 pairs, sit down. And then I go 10 and 20 and 40. I didn't go 25, 30, 35, 40. I doubled it. I just kept 20, 40, 80, 160, 320. Now, when you do that, every time you raise the number, about half the people standing up sit down, which is a very interesting kind of thing about how numbers work. And so the person in the room with the most shoes had 800 pairs of shoes. Okay. I was not in the Philippines. I was not talking to Imelda Marcos, right? Like,
Yeah.
this wasn't a fashion runway in Paris. Okay. This is an entrepreneur conference in Miami. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. And then the same room, okay, let's do domain names. There was one guy in the room that had 5 million domain names and one that had 10. Now, that is probably like a fashion runway in Paris because it is an entrepreneur conference. So you would probably expect people to own a lot of domain names to be in the room, but I didn't expect 5 or 10 million. Now, that's probably not like the scientifically weirdest story I could tell you, but it is certainly, I think both of those are well beyond what most people would think you would just get in a room of 300 people. Okay. And like people do not realize how lopsided and unequal the world fundamentally is. And like we were talking about politics a little bit ago, do you realize that pretty much all of the wealth distribution arguments that happen in any political campaign, which it's got to be half or 2/3 of the entire discussion.
Sure.
Right. Like, well, how are we going to do healthcare and how much are we going to tax the rich? You realize all of those are 80-20 questions and they're all there because you can't make 80-20 go away. And then you could even say that like half of the political promises that ever get made are essentially promises that we're going to eradicate 80-20, which is like saying we're going to get rid of gravity.
Right.
And I think marketers can appreciate this, especially because, well, if you do any kind of marketing consulting, if you build websites, if you write copy, if you do PPC, if you do coaching, people put all these things in front of you and you learn to separate your impulse to buy from your sensibilities about communication, right? And so, like, I see all kinds of things. I'm never tempted to buy them. Like, somebody could have a Lamborghini website, and I'm not sitting there going, oh, I want to buy a Lamborghini. I would never buy a Lamborghini. I'm just not the kind of guy who would do that. But I can evaluate whatever he says as a professional and go, well, your headline is really bad and I don't really like that picture. And you completely buried the lead on this feature and the new engine that they designed. And I could do all that. And so marketers have this ability to detach. Okay. And I think it's really fascinating when you step back and you look at what's going on in the world. Can you just look at Trump and Biden in a completely detached manner? And can you just sort of fold your arms and critique what is going on and say, okay, so why did he write the speech that way? What buttons is he pushing? Like, Trump is better at racking the shotgun. Maybe we should define that term than probably anybody I've ever seen ever. And he's separating the likers from the non-likers with impunity every day.
Yeah.
And he doesn't care. It's why he's so effective, even though so many people hate his guts. Fascinating.
It is fascinating. And you did this thing where you folded your arms and you just sat back. And I agree with that because there's a fascination with watching this stuff unfold. That's why when I go back to the insurance business, I was fascinated by how people were communicating. I was fascinated by how I was communicating and the stories that I would tell. That's why we created a content marketing company on the heels of the insurance business because of this fascination that I wanted to just explore and keep on exploring. Like you said, rack the shotgun, create these stories, tell these things and real stories, real anyway. And then you use Trump as an example because it's funny because you'll see people out there that are in the background and just exploring it. They might be called a Biden supporter one day and a Trump supporter the next day because they're just intrigued by the whole process. They're more fascinated by all of it. You use the word racking the shotgun. It's funny because I have that written down. You know, we talk about it a lot in business and sales. If we're in the marketing business, let's say someone is out there and their thing is social media. Well, you might come across someone that thinks social media is the dumbest thing they've ever heard. Well, they're the unconvincible, most likely, right? Maybe they're not, but right on the surface, they're the unconvincible. if you say something to them and they come back with you like, I hate social media, well, perhaps you're talking to the wrong person, right? So that is racking the shotgun. And we see it a lot in sales. I've seen it with people here. Early on in their careers, they would be talking to the wrong people.
Let me tell the original story. So
Yes.
my friend John Paul Mendoza, when he was a senior in high school, he dropped out of Catholic school in Denver, hitchhiked to Las Vegas, and became a professional gambler. His mother was delighted with this. She, right?
Yeah.
She just couldn't wait for her son to move to Vegas. So he's been in Vegas now for several weeks, playing poker for a living, finding this much harder than he imagined that it would be. And so he goes to a gambling bookstore to pick up some more gambling books. And he finds this guy in the bookstore who owns a professional gambling ring. And so they get into a conversation. And John goes, "Do you think you could teach me what you guys do?" And he says, "Well, for a percentage of your winnings, for a nickel, for 5%, I'll teach you what I do." And so they shake hands. And as soon as they shake on it, "Jump in the Jeep, John. We're going for a ride." Okay. So they're in the Jeep. They're going down the highway. And John goes, "Okay, so tell me, how do I win more poker games?" And he says, "The way you win more poker games is you have to play people who are going to lose. And those people are called marks. You do not play some other professional gambler who's good at this. You find the kid from Wichita who got $5,000 from his grandmother and he flew to Las Vegas. That's who you want." He goes, "Well, where do I find that guy?" And he goes, "Here, I'll show you." And he pulls into the parking lot of a strip club. And they go into the strip club. And there's women and there's rock and roll and there's music and there's bikers and people drinking and all the stuff that goes on in a place like that. And Rob, the guy, he sits John down at one of the tables. And Rob always carried a sawed-off shotgun everywhere he went. He pulls a sawed-off shotgun out of his jacket. He holds it into the table and he opens the chamber and he slams it shut. So it goes. And in the middle of this club with rock and roll and, shall we say, plenty of distractions, there's a few biker dudes over in the corner. They're like, "Hey, where'd that noise come from?" Right? Like they're reaching for their guns. They're ready to rumble. And the owner comes over. He's like, "Hey, what are you guys doing over here?" "It's all right. Just teaching the lad a lesson. Not going to cause any trouble here." "John, did you see those biker dudes turn their heads when I made that noise?" And he's like, "Yeah." And he goes, "Don't play poker with them. They're not marks. Play poker with everybody else." Okay. Now that is racking the shotgun. Okay. Every time Trump says something controversial, he is racking the shotgun. And there's going to be people who agree and people who disagree, and he's separating them, right? And every time you send an email, some people open it, some people don't, some people click on it, some people don't, some people join the webinar, some people don't, some people buy from the webinar, some people don't, right? And it just goes on and on and on. And everything you do is rack the shotgun. And if there's anything that marketers do, they do it timidly. Like, well, I kind of hope I can get everybody. So like, just the other day, I was talking to a client and his wife. I had them both on Zoom. And he goes, "I got this consulting business and I don't like consulting with conventional thinkers. I like consulting with renegades. And my wife is afraid of me being offensive by talking about renegades and renegade ideas." I said, "Listen, that's what you are." Okay. And I told his wife, I said, "Okay, you're the cautious and more reasonable spouse. I know one of those because I'm married to one too." Right?
Yeah.
My wife is a more reasonable person than I am. Okay. And I said, "So I get that. And my wife gets that. Maybe you two should get together." But I said, "Jeff, you need to put out exactly who you are and exactly who you want. And you need to rack the shotgun." And it's not just saying the word renegade, by the way. It's displaying renegade thinking. It's show, don't tell. right? And you make a very clear impression, and you have to be willing to not be liked.
Yes.
And I know we're all trained to be liked and to be people pleasers, but I tell you, I can hardly think of any exceptions. The most successful people are willing to not be liked. I mean, pick any really popular band, right? There's people that hate their music. And people hate their music for the same reason the other people love them. It's the same list, right?
Why do we focus on the people that don't open the email, the people that unsubscribe? That's an issue because that's a reason why people won't. You're talking about marketers, they won't put out content. And not if it's a marketer, if it's just a business, they don't want to get started because of what someone might say. It takes time, right? It takes a habit. It takes the courage. It takes the going through it and understanding. Or if you rack the shotgun, you're worried about those bikers. You're not worried about everybody else, right? You're going down this wrong path. And then there's so many different angles that we could take it down to. Like, why is it scary to cut that stuff out and not worry about it, right? We see it in sales all the time. Someone's worried about, I have so much good flow business, but they also have some good larger business, let's say. But they don't want to lose the flow, like the wife that you're talking about, because that's the steady, that's the consistency that if I give that up, I might lose everything.
Well, this is where it almost seems logical because 80-20 tells you that only 20% of the audience is probably going to want what you are trying to do, and 80% won't. Okay, so the rejection outnumbers the acceptance inherently by 4-1. Okay. And since we all hate pain and we all hate rejection, we naturally focus on that. Going back to Trump, okay, think about it. Like, I don't think it's ever 50-50 when he does stuff. Okay, most things he does irritate most people. Okay, but he's literally willing to irritate the 90% to polarize the 10% in his favor.
Mm-hmm.
Because what people don't understand is that everything occurs from small minorities. Okay, so like think about how in the last 10 years, a huge attention has been given to trafficking, right? And there's this whole movement. Like, I don't even think that was a term 15 years ago, but it's a household word now, right?
Right.
I bet you about 12 people made that happen.
Yeah.
12 people took that issue to the top of the national consciousness and made sure you're hearing something about that every 2 weeks.
Right.
It's a very small number of people who made that happen. It's always a very small number of people. Okay, Jesus had 12 disciples. That's not just an aphorism. No, like 12 people to completely change the world.
Yes.
This is always the case. So it's always the case that the small minority person potentially has the upper hand.
You have conviction. Like every time, whether I've read your books or had this conversation with you, have gone back and looked at things that you've said, you have strong convictions in what you say. There's no ambiguity in it. Like, I don't have to get lost. I know where you stand, right?
Yes.
And again, through writing, through talking, that's a consistent approach, which is, I think, obviously great for marketing, right? So what you say, what you write, what you talk about in person, what you send in a text message, if it's consistent, people can understand it.
Yes.
That's powerful. And have you always been this way? Like,
well, when I was dating my wife, you know, the one that's more reasonable than I am,
right.
like we were probably 19 years old and I was ripping on Elevator Muzak. And she thought I was being kind of mean. And she goes, you know, Perry, I bet you can't even define elevator music. And I thought about it and I said, it's music where the identity of the musicians is irrelevant. Okay. They got somebody arranged some Elton John song into a bunch of milk toast and they hired a bunch of union musicians to come and play the trumpet for $18 an hour. And now I'm in a doctor's office listening to this.
Yeah.
Okay. So think about the answer I gave. It is where the identity of the musician is irrelevant. Okay. That's the complete opposite of how any healthy music works. The identity of Bob Dylan is totally relevant, right? And the identity of Tom Petty is totally relevant, because why are they listening to it? Because they like his style. In fact, I had a Cyndi Lauper tune going through my head. I've never particularly a fan or anything, but I just thought,
Yeah.
that is a person with a very distinctive voice and a very distinctive style. It is instantly recognizable. Well, what I believe about most humans is that most humans are immediately recognizable after they develop their voice. And when I was learning copywriting, I was getting mentored by John Carlton, and he made this comment that really jumped out at me. He said, "You are starting to find your voice as a copywriter." Okay, so like if you play guitar and you think that Eddie Van Halen is the greatest thing since the history of the earth, if you get good at playing guitar, you will do a decent imitation, hopefully, of Eddie Van Halen. But here's the thing. By the time you start getting any better than decent at being Eddie Van Halen, you will actually start to be very good at sounding like you. And that's the progression, is we imitate people who somewhat resemble our own potential. But as we start to get there, we find that we outgrow that.
Sure.
Early Rush sounds like Led Zeppelin. But Rush has not sounded like Led Zeppelin in about 35 years because they created their own completely unique sound.
Yeah. People don't like that when they go in their own direction either, right? Because at the beginning, they get the fans of people they were used to that. And then they're going to perhaps rack the shotgun with a new sound, with a new song, with new lyrics.
Yes.
Fans are going to be like, wait a second, I don't like that. Taylor Swift's a perfect example of it. When my daughter was listening in the car, and it's so interesting, listening to one of her albums, it sounds very different. And she has fans that were so angry about it. But then she got all new kinds of fans from different genres of music now that came on board, and she doesn't care, right? She just keeps going. And that's interesting, like that analogy with music. And I've seen it play out with business leaders, entrepreneurs. They go down this path of creating content, let's say. And at the beginning, they'll be stuck in these bells and whistles. Not all, everyone's different, but thinking of an example, someone in the financial services space, and they're creating content, they're telling stories, and they're talking about why their company's good and a little bit about their story, but they're not going there. And then they say this story, and I'm like, that's the story. That's the thing people want to hear. And it had nothing to do with your business right now. Absolutely nothing. But that story is why people work with you, because you're leading them down this path. So he had to go down this path to better content, to pulling out his stories. And that was his uniqueness that people wanted to be a part of. And I see that play out over and over again. You tell the story in your book, The 80-20, that you came across another book. I think someone had gifted you the book or said, you should read this book. So you go and read the book, and it like, I got to stop everything. You run home. I believe you're on the floor of your kitchen and your wife walks in. And I think that's perfect, because that's telling the story. We do want to hear the principle. We want to hear how it works. How did you get to this point? Like, why are you on the kitchen floor and your wife walks in? She's like, what have I done? Like, who would I marry? Right?
Yes, that really happened. It was Richard Koch's 80-20 book. And he just made this throwaway remark on page 14 that 80-20 has an awful lot to do with chaos and fractals. And then he just went on. It was like, hey, wait a minute. Like, I have like several of these books are books about chaos theory. And it was like, oh, wait a minute. Is that what this is? Right. Well, the basic idea of chaos theory is that there are patterns inside of patterns, inside of patterns, inside of patterns, inside of patterns. So, for example, let's say it's raining today, and there's a little stream flowing from the edge of your sidewalk to your driveway in the corner of your yard. The shape of that stream may be indistinguishable from the Mississippi River. That if you took a picture of that and you put it next to an aerial photo of the Mississippi, nobody might even be able to tell the difference. That the micro and the macro are based on the same set of patterns, and that the micro patterns are inside the patterns. So all the little tiny little trickles, which go to rivers, which go to streams, which go to Mississippi rivers, and they feed each other, that the patterns are just, it's the same pattern on all these different scales. I was like, oh, is that how this works? Oh, my word. I'd never thought about that before. And the reason I ran home and I'm laying on the floor with all these papers and a calculator and having a kind of a little conniption is because I suddenly realized that this had been under my nose all my life and I had just never seen it. And I just don't think there's anything more pleasurable than when you suddenly see something you've been missing every day of your life and you see it all at once. Woo! Okay. So at that point, I'd been in my own business for a year and a half, and I had a year and a half worth of data, and a year and a half worth of customers, and a year and a half worth of leads. And all of a sudden I could see these patterns. It's like, that means I could have predicted a whole bunch of this stuff a year ago and known exactly how it was going to play out. And so if you really understand 80/20, it's a way of predicting the future based on very tiny amounts of information. And I just had never seen anybody use it that before. And so that's what inspired me to write 80/20 Sales and Marketing.
Wow. We need those types of stories of how people got there. I go back further to this time when you talk about action, being busy. Like people wear it as a badge of honor, how busy they were and how many tasks that they were doing. And it sounds like you were that guy. You were busy. You were...
Okay, so I was in multi-level marketing where, show the plan, draw circles, go recruit people. Okay. And I picked up this phrase that I read in a magazine, and the phrase was, massive action solves every problem. I'm like, yeah. And, there's this whole mentality out there. It's kind of a Grant Cardone sort of, just work 10 times harder and make 10 times more phone calls. And well, I learned so many bad habits from that. Okay. So basically, I was in a business that didn't really work. So I remember I went to this rally, with about 300 people, and I got an award for doing 15 presentations in a month, because that's what you're supposed to do. And they go, okay, so who's a go-getter? All the go-getters come up on the stage, and it was me and one other guy. Now, I was starting to get wise, but I wasn't quite there yet. I was still drinking the pink Kool-Aid, still believing everything. But I had a very powerful insight that if you wanted to be successful doing that, what they told you is you got to have 15 meetings a month, every month. And I thought, you know what? He showed the plan 15 times last month, and so did I. And I'm not making any progress, and neither is he, because I've been watching him, and I've sure been watching me. But we are the only two people in the room who actually know that this doesn't work. The other 298 people in the room think that if they did this, they would get rich. So they're here sitting in their chairs waiting for the lightning to strike, for them to get inspired to go do something, because this is their ticket to the good ship Hope. And he and I are the only people here who know this doesn't work. Okay. And that thought still had to burn its way through my brain for another year or two before I finally really realized what was going on. But in the years that I did that, I learned to medicate my sense of failure with busyness, because as long as you're in motion, you're not a bad guy.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I learned. So what I managed to do was I managed to strain my marriage to the breaking point, neglect my kids, stress myself out, and do things that didn't work. Okay. Now, what I should have done was I should have stopped doing everything that wasn't working and take a big chill pill for a while.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I should have done. Now, in my book, Detox, Declutter, Dominate, I've got this story at the end about a guy named Mark McShirley. So Mark is living in his in-laws' basement with his wife and his kids because he's not making enough money. He's running a roofing company with a friend. The roofing company isn't really making any money. So he's got a job selling advertising in Catholic church bulletins, which, let me assure you, is an incredibly lucrative career.
Yeah.
Right? And he's been reading my stuff. He's been learning the principles I teach. And he has a conversation with his wife and he goes, so honey, we need to make this roofing company into a star business. And I got these things that needs to do. But he goes, I'm making $40,000 a year selling this bulletin advertising. Honey, I think I need to quit my job so I can focus on this roofing thing and figure out how to do this. I don't have any time to think when I'm making all these phone calls and running around and selling ads. So I'm quitting my job and I'm going to literally go to the coffee shop and I'm going to sit there and I'm going to think about how to do this business until I figure it out. And then I'm going to do it. And the worst thing that could happen to us is we just end up living here in your parents' basement for 6 more months than we were going to. That's the worst thing that can happen. I think it's actually going to turn out better.
Mm.
And she's like, okay.
Yeah.
And that's what he did. And that is a $15 million company now 5 years later.
Wow.
Okay. And it's actually an extraordinary company. And it's because he stopped to think about what he was doing, especially now. This is more true in 2020 than it was 10 years ago. And it was more true 10 years ago than it was 20 years ago. If you are spending all your time going, pushing, and you're not really getting anywhere, you need to stop. Because the definition of insanity is continuing to do what you already know doesn't work. Now, if you don't actually know whether it works or not, like sometimes you just don't know. Some things take 5 years. Most things don't, right?
Right.
But dude, like if you're just medicating yourself with busyness, you need to get a reality check and you need to stop.
Did you have to go through, because you talked about, you're very vulnerable and talking about your kids, your wife, your business, your health, just everything that was going on. Did you have to go through that period of time, as difficult as it was, to become what you are today?
Yeah, I do. And I'll just admit, I'm doing coulda, woulda, shoulda when I tell you this.
Sure.
But I am telling you what I do now. Okay. Like now, I do not throw myself into things and work madly and crazily, interminably, even though they don't work. If something doesn't work, I take a step back. Okay.
Yeah.
There's a saying in the book of Proverbs, in all labor there is profit. Even the wasted effort becomes valuable once you become self-aware. And like back when I was in MLM and trying to shake hands and have meetings, like all that kind of stuff, I picked up a lot of skills that I now use every day.
Yeah.
Including my writing and storytelling. I mean, I learned how to be a storyteller in MLM. It was that and David and Goliath.
Sure.
So it didn't go to waste, but it was also like breaking up with a psychotic girlfriend. Like when I stopped pouring my time into that and I left and I moved on, all of a sudden everything I did started working. It was holding me back. I mean, we've all been in relationships that held us back, whether it was a job or a person or ideology.
Yeah. So what is work? I'm reading this book, getting through many books going on right now, Leisure, the Basis of Culture, and it talks about work. What is work? It gets into this stuff in a very deep way.
Mm-hmm.
And you talk about Renaissance time in your book, and you held it up. I'll hold it up too, because you were kind enough to send this to me.
Yeah.
And I think everyone should read it. They should read the 80-20. There's many books, right? But going on a walk in the morning or reading or journaling, a lot of times people could frown upon that. Well, that's not work. You're not busy, like you talked about.
Right.
You're not being the activity monster that you need to be. You need to call more people. And no doubt, you need to talk to people. Like I think we have to sit here too and say, well, you have to have action. You just have to have the right action. So it doesn't mean don't work. It doesn't mean just go drift off into nowhere forever. It won't work either that way.
Yeah.
What is work, right? Because I think even I would feel guilty if I wasn't going through these different tasks some years ago. I have to do these things. I have to show to the people in my company that I'm doing these things too. But it was like, no. I need to be having these types of conversations. I need to be journaling.
Mm-hmm.
I need to be reading different types of, I need to explore these things. But I asked you that question, like, what is work?
So I had to define 4 kinds of work instead of 1. An analogy would be, in English, we basically have 1 word for love. The Greeks had 3. So the Greeks had phileo, the word Philadelphia comes from it, city of brotherly love. And that was just like loving your neighbor, right?
Mm-hmm.
They had eros, which is sexual love, which is obviously completely different, right? And then there was agape love, which was like totally self-sacrificing love. Well, if you have those 3 distinctions, you have a very powerful communication tool that you didn't have before when you just had 1. And so I defined, it's on page 32 of Detox Declutter, is there's Renaissance, work ethic, sweetness, and barnacles. So let me go through these one at a time. I actually put them on quadrants, which the book explains. Let me start with work ethic. Okay. Work ethic is what most people understand as work. But even then, it's referring to the highly productive work. Okay. So if you're an attorney and you bill at $250 an hour and you're doing the kind of work you're best at or the kind of client you should be doing it for, and you're getting paid $250 an hour, that is what I mean by work ethic. I don't mean mowing the lawn, okay, or changing the oil in your car or shuffling papers, right? Work ethic, okay? Then there's another kind, which is barnacles. Barnacles is shuffling papers when you should be doing $250 an hour work. It is what most people lapse into when your OCD takes over and it's hitting refresh on your email inbox like 832 times a day, or just like wandering over onto Twitter because you're a little bored at the moment and then 45 minutes goes by, right? Or like, I got a friend who, if he's in a bad place mentally, he'll start obsessing about his checking account. And he'll start like, oh, that check didn't get cashed yet. Just these weird things that we do. I'd say most people spend 2/3 of their day in barnacles. Okay. Then there's sweetness, which is just taking Sunday off. Okay. Or spending the evening with your family and not doing work. And then the 4th category is what I call Renaissance time. And Renaissance time is unpredictably productive work. In fact, it's usually wildly unpredictable, and it's usually not predictable, except it's occasionally incredibly productive. So let me give you several examples of Renaissance time. First of all, like the number 1 kind of Renaissance time is every morning. I have not missed a day in 7 years. I get a notebook and I journal and I get my thoughts together. I have my cup of tea. I listen to some music. No social media, no emails, no texts, no rest of the world pulling my strings. Okay. And I get my head straight first, and then I get into my work ethic stuff. Okay. And like, you just got to take my word for it. That is the $10,000 an hour time. That is, you get yourself sorted out. You get your priorities sorted out. You get your insights. Like, when you go to sleep at night, one of the reasons we all have to sleep is our brain's got to process all this stuff in your subconscious, and you dream and everything. Then you go in the shower and you get these great ideas in the shower. Okay. If you get out of your shower and turn on CNN, what that is like, it is like you took the nicest buttercream milk with the cream rising to the top and you just dumped it in the yard on the grass and then ate Fruit Loops for breakfast. Okay.
Yeah.
You come out of the shower and you just had a good night's sleep. You should be like capturing the inspiration, figuring out what you do, figuring out what's important, praying, meditating, getting right in the world, and then face the world. Okay. So that's part of Renaissance time. The other part of Renaissance time is it might be the person you have lunch with who's a friend of a distant colleague, where it's like, oh, that could turn into an interesting meeting or could turn into an interesting conversation. People have studied and found out that, like, let's say you're looking for a job, or it could be a client or anything. If you go have lunch with your best friend and ask them who they know that might be hiring, that's not typically very productive. But if you go have lunch with somebody who's on the very edge of your social sphere and you ask them who they know who might be looking for somebody, that's where like the big breakthroughs come from. Okay. Richard Koch calls it the superconnect principle. So 95% of the time, that lunch is just a lunch and it doesn't produce anything. But 5% of the time, it produces something great. Like I always get my best ideas when I'm like at a rock concert or pushing my kid on a swing. I don't get my best ideas when I'm sitting in front of my computer,
Right.
banging away. Like inspiration never comes when your fists are clenched.
It feels like society says that's not right. You just have to get to the office, get in the box, and go to work. And it's no different than putting a piece of content out, having a podcast, writing a blog, that you're instantly going to be judged by those actions. And some people might not like it. It goes back to what we talked about before. But once you can create that conviction that you have, that we've talked about, and the habit, which I think was in one of your email newsletters, which people should subscribe to because it's good thoughts. If you're trying to like, always talk about like control what you see, control your feed, Perry, you should be in people's feeds because it's good things to think about, right? Whether they want to work with you or not is not the point, is you want to control that feed. But having that conviction, right? Having that habit, that was the word I was looking for. That's where you create this, where you wake up and you haven't missed a beat in 7 years. That's not easy to do because you're being judged and it's hard to create that habit because you have other habits. You hear it all the time, right? People, they do pick up their phones and they do look at social media and everyone's at a different track and you might fall off. Like even if you had fallen off the wagon sometime, that's okay, and recognizing it.
Right.
It's very hard to do though, but it is that conviction and believing that this is a way to go and to have the habit to stick with it as best as you possibly can. And maybe it's not exactly what you talk about and what they should do, although it probably would work. But there might be something that works for them. And I think you even say that. It's not a prescription exactly how to do it. It's perhaps how it works for them. Get into that mindset. It's hard to do though, because the world's saying you can't do that. Get in the box. And I talk about getting outside the box in many ways. I've realized it too. I'm at my office now, but I can walk. I can go outside. And it's at least 3 times a day. And I'm not here all day.
Yeah.
But if I am here all day, or if I am here for a few hours, I will be outside.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's just, I can't sit in here. It'll drive you crazy.
Right.
But it won't drive you crazy until you allow it to drive you crazy. And I think that's when you can then start exploring, what is that? Why are you driving yourself crazy? You have to go to the belly of the beast, right? And to then realize like you had done before with the massive action, what that's creating when you talk about time and space to think about the problems. 1% of the problems fixes 50% of the problems.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Because 80-20 says that 1% of what you do produces 50% of what you get. Okay. So it's perfectly okay to have space to think about problems and think about how, well, I'm supposed to look busy. Well, yeah, if it's 1863 and you're laying railroad track with a shovel and a sledgehammer and spikes, then yeah, get busy. Look busy. In that world, if you look busy, you are busy. If you look like you're building a train track, you are building a train track. But you know what? You can almost never tell who's productive by what you see them doing.
Yep.
So most of my customers and clients think for a living. They don't just pull levers. All right, you're a Facebook pay-per-click manager and you post ads. Well, all right. So yeah, that is a physical activity. And we could watch you do that just like we watch a person lay railroad tracks. But on Facebook, 0.1% of the ads get about 98% of the impressions. And so if your ads work, it's because you had a good idea. And where are you going to get good ideas? Well, I get good ideas by praying, by reading, by being out in nature, by listening to and watching inspiring things, by meeting interesting people. I don't get good ideas by following rigid formulas. So if you're my customer, you think for a living.
Yeah.
And if you think for a living, you're my customer. And I just cracked the shotgun. Not everybody thinks for a living,
Sure.
but the ones I'm talking to today are.
Yeah. And feeling empowered to be able to think, to be able to read, to go outside of your own industry, to attend events that have really nothing to do, to
Yes.
watch something on TV that might not, like, that's a waste of time. Well, no, actually, it's not a waste of time. You know, if you're convicted in that.
Right.
It's also, you go in the activity and you get so honed in on reaching out to people. I got to call this person. I get this person. I got to get in front of this person. Well, I got 2 examples today of it being the opposite. And you say a prospect that finds you first is more likely to buy than if you find them first. All right. So I had never reached out to you. I'd read your book. So I'd already been a client of yours in a way. Right.
Mm.
And then I never even thought to say, well, let's have Perry on the podcast. But somewhere, somehow, someone said Perry should be on Eric's podcast, Entrepreneur Perspectives. Well, that's proof right there. We had something out there and your team had reached out to us. If I had reached out to you, I bet, I'm not certain, maybe someone would have said, that sounds good. Let's get Perry on that podcast. I'm willing to bet though, if I had reached out first, then you wouldn't have been on the podcast. And that's not saying anything about me. I'm just giving an example.
Right.
Another example is I had a call this morning. It's our 3rd call. Company had found us on Google, had reached out to us. They want us to produce a podcast for their CEO because he wants to think, he wants to tell stories, he wants to share stories. They came to us first. We did not reach out to them. That doesn't mean that you can't reach out to people, but if they come to you, they're more than willing, because that's what you're saying. Doesn't mean that they won't buy or they won't be a client. It's just if they reach out to you, you came to us.
Yeah.
In a genuine way, in a good way, and have great conversations. And if it's consistent with everything that's happened, some good stuff can come from that.
Totally.
But so much has been gone in. You talked about it already in activity, but those 2 examples just slapped me across the face as I'm getting ready to chat with you today.
Well, when I went from chasing people around to attracting people to me, my life just totally changed. And it was better than any form of therapy. I mean, I was just selling industrial network hardware and software and to engineers. But the fact that an engineer actually wanted to talk to me rather than just trying to figure out how not to talk to me, you can only take all that rejection for so long after a while.
Right.
It just gets hideous.
Yes. It all feels like play. And when I have this conversation to you, that's how I feel. I enjoy this. Like, well, what do you do? Well, this is it. I love these types of conversations. When I hear you talk and I see you talk and the expressions and the just conviction, but it feels like play. And that's what you talk about with Renaissance Time. It feels like play. Like, I don't even feel stressed out by it. There's always going to be stresses. So I could go on and on. People should buy the book. This is the book. They should buy the 80-20 book. When I said this is the book, The Detox, Declutter, Dominate. Thank you for sending that to us. There is something else that I want to finish with because you talk about the espresso machine.
Oh, yeah.
And I've seen this play out as well. And I think this is an important piece. And I want you to, get into this and how people can get a hold of you, how they can subscribe to the newsletter, where they can find your books. But that's an important piece as you're building a business, that pricing changes. The types of people that are willing to buy your products, they have a willingness to pay something different because they value it so greatly. But anyway, I'm going to let you tell the espresso machine story.
Yeah. So this is the best way for especially like a small service business or a freelancer or a small company to rapidly increase their sales and increase their profits even more. And I call it the principle of the $2,700 espresso machine. And 80-20 says that 20% of the people want to give you 80% of your money, and 5% of the people want to give you 2/3 of your money, and 1% of the people want to give you half of their money. So what does that mean? It means that a small percentage of your customers want to spend a lot of money, and they will if given an opportunity to do so. Okay, so for every 1,000 people who spend $5 on a latte at Starbucks, one will spend $2,700 on an espresso machine. It's almost like a law of physics. And Starbucks knows this. And this means that for every $5,000 of lattes, you're going to sell $2,700 worth of espresso machines, right? That's a lot, right? That's a lot more revenue. And so there's an online bonuses that come with the book, and it's actually got a calculator, and you can punch in the numbers and it will show you, okay, so I've got 100 people who spent $100 buying my video course on how to shoot video. How many of them will give me $10,000 to just come to their office and like do this thing for them?
Mm-hmm.
And most small companies who, you have some kind of a productized thing, you can sell something that's 5 times, 10 times more expensive, and you don't need any new customers. Your existing customers already have the capacity and the inclination to spend the money. And so it increases the amount of money that you get per person. It's a key principle in making upsells work, because like most of the time, if you're advertising something on the internet and you're paying Facebook or Google or Instagram money for traffic, you're going to sell something and you're going to lose money on that traffic because like where the water level is in bid prices. But if you add an espresso machine to that offer and 1 out of 20 people takes it, you might double or triple your revenue just on that one thing. So that's the principle of the $2,700 espresso machine.
Well, you give us a lot to think about. And obviously, we have a lot of Renaissance time now to think about all these things. Perry, I appreciate it. I mean, like I said, when I saw the email come through and we had these conversations, it's been an honor to chat with you, to learn more, to get me to continue to think about these things. I appreciate it. Where can people buy your books, where they can learn more about you?
Just go to Amazon and pick up Detox, Declutter, Dominate. This is a 36-page, highly illustrated success manual for the next 20 years. You can literally use this to figure out, what am I going to do this afternoon to make my business more profitable? But at the same time, it is a strategy manual literally for the next 20 years. I've never seen any other book like that. It's very short. It's 8,000 words. Not a word is wasted. Robert Scrobe helped me put this together. It is the leanest, meanest business book you've ever read. Detox, Declutter, Dominate. It's about $9 US on Amazon.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's a very unique approach. It feels right in the hands. And then your website is perrymarshall.com. Is that right?
perrymarshall.com. You can get on our 30-day Street MBA email list, and we'll make you think every single day when that email arrives.
Yep, I would agree with that. Perry, it's been a privilege.
Thank you, Eric. It was a pleasure.
In case you haven't noticed, we love podcasts. In fact, we love building podcasts, everything from development to production. Because of all that, we're building a one-of-a-kind podcast network. If you have a podcast or looking to launch a new podcast, then we should talk. You can message me on Twitter at Eric_Kaz or hit us up any way that works for you. Let's talk about your podcast joining this one-of-a-kind podcast network.